Hello, welcome to my second video post. As I said at the end of yesterday's first post, today's topic is going to be about Brexit. I don't even know where to begin, other than to say it's made me tear my hair out for the past 3 years. Anyway, let's dive straight in. So I'm going to begin this with reading a poem. So it's going to serve two purposes. I'm going to talk about Brexit. I'm also going to give you a flavour of my poetry. So this is one I wrote on the 27th of July last year, 2018. It's on the topic of Brexit and all it's thrown up. It could have been written yesterday, though, because we are no further forward than we were in July last year, and we're potentially on the cusp of a Boris Johnson premiership, which is like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. But let's come on to that a little later. First of all, the poem. It's a good way to begin this second post, I think. You'll realize from the title that, as I said yesterday, I have no love for my country, but it's actually meant to be a sympathetic poem. A rather regretful and sorrowful reflection on what Britain has become, and in particular what Brexit has done to Britain. The I Hate Britain campaigns, parts 2 to 10. We lost the world, and now we have lost the country. Goodbye to the land that once ruled the lot. Thank Bojo for this sorry lot, in which we all now find ourselves in this once hallowed plot. I think, in all honesty, he does not care a jot, for in my mind's eye I see that this once hallowed plot has become like a wounded doe, hunted by the most callous foe. The doe lies on the ground, maimed in great pain, anger and bewilderment seared across her face. She looks up as aid approaches. In a look she reproaches. The aid has come just in time, but the aid that can be given is not the aid to save, but rather the aid to put the lame and maimed doe to permanent rest. For that is the fate that serves her best. No longer has she the will or ability to lead the rest. No longer is she on an eternal quest. No longer her domain an island blessed. Hers now the fate of the most frightful pest. Her favourite fawns have now flown the nest, and she's left to raise the feckless rest. But she no more now, that the end is near, lest a miracle can appear. But with Bojo and May, Corbyn and Rees-Mogg to steer, the only miracle for which she can hope is that the end is near. And so the aid that came in the form it may rang her neck and put a shotgun bullet through her brain. As I said, that's from July 2018. My musings at the time on what Brexit was doing, and it's still doing to us. What Brexit has done is, in fact, shown how modern Britain is essentially no longer a country fit for purpose. What Brexit has shown is that this narrative about an isolated elite being essentially cut off from the rest of society has some truth to it. If we look back at the background to the Brexit referendum, it was essentially the policy of one man, who was previously the worst Prime Minister Britain has ever had, David Cameron. Of course, he's been soundly beaten on that score by Theresa May, but that's not entirely her fault. David Cameron essentially had the policy of holding an in-out referendum, as he liked to call it, on Britain's membership of the EU, not because he was a genuine leaver, he was a soft Remainer, I suppose. He thought that he'd win in his arrogance. He thought, I hold this referendum, I give people a binary choice. Do we stay in the European Union or do we leave the European Union? Now, that tells you everything you need to know about the intelligence of this man, this cretinously stupid man who had the benefits of an Eton and Oxford education, who had all the benefits that the vast majority of people in Britain and many other countries dream of, but simply never have. And yet, he cast all that aside. My expensive Oxbridge education means nothing. I try to manage the Conservative Party by giving them what they want. This ridiculous referendum. Now, why was it ridiculous? It was ridiculous because it's simply impossible to reduce a question of the complexity of does the United Kingdom remain a member state of the European Union to a binary choice, yes or no. For 40 years, the British state government of both parties, Labour and Conservative, had struggled with this question. Do we actually want to be part of the EU as it began the European community? And what level of integration do we want? Do we want full-blown political integration along the lines of the founding fathers of the European Economic Community, the European Coal and Steel Community back in the 1950s actually wanted? Or do we want something closer to the Council of Europe model, nation-states cooperating at the intergovernmental level, which in the Council of Europe was in fact a British creation, and it was that model which I think all British governments of whatever party always wanted to follow. But that's a completely separate argument. So British governments struggled with this question. Do we want to be part of this supranational body or not? And if we want to be part of it, what level of integration do we actually want? Successive British governments of both parties failed to address this question and failed miserably to make the case for British membership of the European Union. The European community as it was, the European Union as it became. And very often, British governments of both parties simply used the European Union as a scapegoat for the problems which were domestic. Whatever the problem might be. We can't do this because we're bound by European Union regulations and directives, or we can't do this because it violates EU competition law, or whatever it might be. Or, this power no longer resides at Westminster. It's in the hands of Brussels. Scapegoating. Year after year, decade after decade. In this context, it's hardly surprising that if you ask the people in a referendum, should we remain part of the EU or not, of course the majority of people are going to say, oh, no, let's walk out the door. Because we're restrained, we're constrained. There are things we want to do as a country, but we can't. If you don't make a positive case, how on earth can you persuade people of the merits of the case? But the fact remains that very little power had been ceded to Brussels into the European Union. The United Kingdom was still essentially a nation state, part of a supranational organization, but a nation state nonetheless. The problem was that it was a nation state committed at the political level to the European Union, but also committed at the legal level, and also at the level of the individual citizen. Now, this is where I would argue a mistake had been made, that in fact the European Union was always a political project. It was always a project initially between nation states. It was governments that were committed. It was treaties that were signed. It was only in 1992, when this was extended to individual citizens, that things began to change. And I think at that point you can see the ugly little green monster skepticism, Euroscepticism, really begin to rear its head. And Jacob Rees-Mogg's father, Lord Rees-Mogg, actually led the vanguard against opposition to the Maastricht Treaty, which was the Treaty on European Union, which founded the European Union. And his argument was that, in fact, Parliament had no right to pass this treaty and to enact the laws that would flow from it, and to create, out of British citizens, European citizens as well. And that's, well, the political maelstrom of the early 1990s that hamstrung John Major's government was essentially caused by this opposition to European Union citizenship, amongst other powers that were pooled, not necessarily ceded, but pooled with the European Union. Not forgetting, of course, that it was a conservative government that actually not only signed the Treaty on European Union, which was the Maastricht Treaty, but also the Single European Act. People often forget Thatcher's grandchildren, the current Eurosceptic members of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, are essentially Thatcher's grandchildren. But they all seem to forget that, in fact, the Single European Market, enacted by the Single European Act of 1986, was essentially Margaret Thatcher's creation. So her grandchildren are now rejecting wholeheartedly and outright her legacy, perhaps her greatest achievement. Not that I'm a Thatcherite, don't misinterpret what I'm saying here, but for all the damage she did, all the radical changes that she introduced, the Single European Market is perhaps the most consequential, the most long-lasting. And now it is being rejected out of hand, wholeheartedly, by the Conservative Party. So, David Cameron, up to the morning after the referendum in 2016, the worst Prime Minister Britain has ever had. Then, to add insult to injury, so we had this cretinously stupid man with this expensive education as an act of party management to try to mollify the rabid Eurosceptic wing of his party, gave his party the referendum policy. We will hold an in-out referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. Subsequently, it was held. Now, every member of the establishment, virtually, the British and the global establishment, pleaded with the British people during the referendum to vote Remain. Because anyone can see that it was in the best interest of the country to remain a member state of the European Union. But David Cameron also singularly, and for a man of his background, his education, hopefully his intelligence, but in fact he's disproven this completely. A man of his intelligence and his background and his education singularly misunderstood the English people in particular. I'm not going to make reference at this stage to the British people, to the wider United Kingdom, but specifically to the English people. The English people have a... I'm going to try to put this as politely as possible. They have a strong sense of themselves, of individualism, of independence, of freedom, and of thumbing their noses to authority. So, what do? If you're the Prime Minister of this particular country, with this particularly independent, freedom-loving people, what do? You try to persuade them through telling them and through co-opting lots of other members of the elite to tell them, this is what you should do. So they will just thumb their noses at you, which is exactly what people did. They thumbed their noses at the elite, telling them how they should think, how they should vote. And that's essentially why we are where we are now. Of course, there were lots of other reasons for it. The austerity policies of the Conservative government introduced from 2010 onwards to try to repair the damage of the global financial crisis and the failures of Labour's economic policies prior to 2010. The general incompetence of the Conservative Party in government on a whole raft of issues. The Conservative Party has always thought of itself, and certainly for most of the 20th century, was considered to be the natural party of government. But what, in fact, in the modern world, it has proved itself to be is grossly incompetent and frighteningly inept, absolutely incapable of managing government affairs, of directing the state. Absolutely incapable. I mean, shockingly incapable. One could even argue that this was the case from 1990 onwards, at the end of Thatcher's premiership, that in fact John Major's government was exactly the same. Certainly the Conservative Party, for the past decade, while it's been in government, and certainly in its wilderness years, if you like, of Labour government from 1997 to 2010, utterly bereft of ideas, utterly bereft of any single individual or group of individuals who I could point to and say, yes, now there's somebody who would make a good Prime Minister. There's a group of people who have a clear ideology, or not necessarily ideology, but a clear idea, a set of ideas, a philosophy of where they want the country to go, where they want the country to be, and how they want the country to get there. That's simply been lacking in the Conservative Party, and it's certainly been lacking since 2010. Beyond austerity, beyond reducing the budget deficit, there has been no other guiding philosophy, no other guiding set of principles. We had David Cameron's big society nonsense, which came and went as quickly as any other meaningless slogan to paint on the side of a bus. And this brings us to the current chaos, the current impasse in Parliament. Theresa May has replaced David Cameron as the worst Prime Minister Britain has ever had. Sorry. I felt genuinely sorry for her watching her resignation on the steps of Downing Street last week. But I don't hold her solely responsible. I hold her advisers, the Conservative Party, and the system itself responsible. Why? Theresa May was never anything more than a third-rate administrator. She came by this epithet of this bloody difficult woman. I think it was Kenneth Clarke, actually, who might have called her that, if my memory serves me correctly. Now, Kenneth Clarke, he would have made a good Prime Minister. He would have been a leader of the Conservative Party, a good Prime Minister. Douglas Hurd, those sorts of people. One nation Conservatives, not these idiots who are currently in charge. The Conservative Party will rue the day when they ever elected people less competent than Kenneth Clarke or Douglas Hurd. But that's another matter. Theresa May believed her own hype. She believed it. She believed her own delusions about herself. So did her advisers. So did the Conservative Party. So that in the election which very hurriedly took place in 2016, in the aftermath of David Cameron's disastrous resignation, and oh yes, David Cameron, he is another point that you should bear in mind, old boy. You may think it's the honourable thing to do to resign when your flagship policy has failed and you've been utterly humiliated. I would argue the opposite. I'd argue that you should stay around to clean up your own mess. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, you didn't even have a plan. You didn't have any forward planning in place. You organised this referendum, held it, resigned the following day, and you didn't bother to put any contingency planning in place whatsoever. So then the country, led by your incompetent Conservative Party, had then to come up with a plan. I mean, you could not make this shit up. You really couldn't. If I did my job like this, I'd expect to lose it tomorrow. And you people running a country. Honestly, this more than anything else tells you that the Conservative Party is absolutely unfit to govern. The party that has always thought of itself as the true party of government is absolutely unfit for government. Utterly bereft of ideas, beyond the nonsense that gets spouted out of the mouths of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Davis, who think that it's possible to walk away from a supranational organization, from international treaties that have been in place and created a complex legal body and complex interrelationships. Like that. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about these people. But Theresa May, the worst Prime Minister Britain has ever had, but not entirely her fault. Her advisers believed her delusions about herself. The Conservative Party believed her delusions about herself, and the other candidates in 2016 simply stood aside. And we were foisted upon us. We had foisted upon us this individual, and I'm not going to... I dislike, in fact, how politics has become so personally denigrating in recent years. I think this is the result of social media, Twitter, and everything else that allows people to make the most appalling and unnecessary personal criticism of people, when in fact there's far more fodder in the professional realm than there could be in the personal for for criticizing people in public life. But anyway, Theresa May lacked communication skills. She lacked empathy. She lacked any affinity for the camera and for public performance. Does a politician, does the leader of a country, a leader of government, need to be a celebrity? No. And I would be very concerned if they thought they were. A leader does need gravitas. A leader does need sobriety. A leader does need to look beyond the most recent opinion polls and to look beyond the short term to what is in the long-term best interest of the country. That is what a leader needs. Theresa May was incapable of doing this either. She put the needs of the Conservative Party ahead of the needs of the country. She was incapable, as I said, she had no affinity for the camera. She was incapable of creating a rapport with anybody, in fact. Her cabinet, the Conservative Party, the country at large, utterly incapable. It's simply beyond her. The only person who supported Theresa May, except Theresa May, was her husband. And I don't think husbands count. A spouse is always going to be your number one cheerleader. The deal Theresa May brought back after 2 years of difficult negotiations was not ideal. It wasn't. But the nature of politics, the nature of international diplomacy is compromise. There is never an ideal situation in life. There is never an ideal contract in law. There is never an ideal outcome in a negotiation. Neither side ever gets everything that they wanted. But a deal was struck. And then the House of Commons proceeded to reject this deal again and again and again. What does this tell us? It tells us quite a lot, actually. It first of all tells us that most members of the House of Commons are members of an elite that does actually consider the electorate to be beneath their contempt, ignorant and ill-informed fools, because it was Parliament, the House of Commons, that passed the European Union Referendum Act, authorizing the European Union referendum. But it seems to me that now Parliament, the House of Commons, thinks that it was the wrong answer. The House of Commons collectively, the Conservative Party, Labour Party and other parties, I'm in the Commons, from the Scottish National Party to the Liberal Democrats, all have failed to do the only thing that the British public instructed Parliament to do, to withdraw from the European Union. What does this tell us? It tells us not only that Parliament holds the electorate in contempt, that Parliament asked a question, expected an answer, didn't get the answer that it wanted, and so now wants to overturn the result of the referendum, and essentially to stick two fingers up to all of those people who voted to leave the European Union. I'm not one of them, but I am a Democrat, and it simply makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and it undermines the very foundation stones of democracy. If you ask the people a question, And then you try to reverse it because you don't like the answer. You are sticking two fingers up to the electorate, and you are destroying any semblance at all in the principles of democracy. And it's no wonder that across the Western world, fringe parties who espouse the most mind-numbingly stupid policies, nativist, nationalist policies, are winning when they see that collectively governments are run by incompetent fools who generally ignore people, and when they don't get the answers to questions that they've asked that they like, they simply ignore them or they reverse them. This is not democracy. Parliament should never have passed the European Union withdrawal bill. The European Union referendum withdrawal bill. It should never have passed this, because it was never possible to reduce a question of this complexity to a binary yes or no answer. As I've said, for 40 years, governments of both parties could never reach a consensus on whether they actually wanted wholeheartedly to integrate fully with the European Union. Britain, because of both parties and because of Parliament, because of the electorate, was only ever 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the European Union. I'm telling you, other European Union countries are quite sick of Britain asking for opt-outs from this and opt-outs from that. Everybody else always knew that Britain was only a half-hearted member of the European Union, only wanted the benefits of trade, but didn't want any of the added political integration. But despite the fact that it was utterly unjustifiable to ask the people a binary yes or no question on a topic of this complexity, Parliament did. Parliament outsourced its responsibility to legislate and to govern to the people. It asked the question. The people gave an answer. The only duty of Parliament is to implement the answer and to find the best way to do that. Theresa May's deal was the only deal, and is still, in fact, when all's said and done, the only deal on the table. It's not ideal, as I've said. Politics is about leadership. It is about compromise. Diplomacy is about compromise. Neither party ever gets everything that they want. That is not the nature of negotiation. If a party gets everything it wants, it's not a negotiation. It's tyranny, essentially, and it's not going to be imposed upon anybody. But here we are. Parliament outsourced its duty through the European Union referendum laws. It asked the question, it didn't like the answer, and it's now reneging on its duty to implement the withdrawal. Every member of Parliament who voted for the European Union withdrawal bill, the European Union referendum bill. Sorry, it's quite complicated, I know. And I'm not reading from a script here. This is all improvised. So it's not easy to keep track of all this and present it in a cogent argument. So Parliament, every member of Parliament who voted for the European Union referendum bill, which then became an act of Parliament, but then has voted against the withdrawal bill, the treaty which was agreed between the UK and the European Union, and has voted against all other options that have been presented, is sticking up two fingers to every person who voted to leave the European Union, is telling the British people and posterity, fuck you, we don't care. You know, we asked you, we didn't like the answer. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You have made yourselves hypocrites and liars. What does this tell us? It tells us the system is broken. It tells us the system is broken. And when the dust has settled, however it settles, if it's ever settled, I don't know that it will be, if it's ever settled, some changes need to be made. Now, I'm not a revolutionary. What I'm going to say might sound like a radical proposal for government, but I'm not a revolutionary. I don't want to see armed revolution in the streets. I don't want to see anything like the other revolutions of 1789 or 1917 repeated. Britain has for a very long time been a stable liberal democracy, and change should only come through the ballot box, through the democratic process, through civil society. All of the principles which Britain has always prided itself on espousing, and upon which Britain is built, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, parliamentary democracy, all of these principles have to remain in place and have to govern any change that comes. But change needs to come. Because what Brexit and the impasse in Parliament has shown us is that the system is no longer fit for the 21st century. The system may have been fit for previous centuries, and it has admittedly worked well for a long time, and in fact the system has worked well as it's been exported through the British Empire, through British cultural influence, through the English language, through the common law. But it's no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. So what needs to change when Brexit has finally been resolved? How should Brexit be resolved? Well, Brexit should be resolved by passing the deal, the treaty that's on the table. It's the only way out. If Parliament really does revoke Article 50, I'm sorry to say that you will have destroyed your legitimacy. You will have destroyed the legitimacy of the House of Commons, of elected members of Parliament, and of the system itself. And you do so at your own peril. I don't want to say this. As I said, I am not a revolutionary. I believe in the system as it's composed, but you have delegitimized the system with your actions. And you have delegitimized yourselves. So what should happen? Brexit has to go ahead. The United Kingdom has to withdraw from the European Union. Yes, at a future date, what is left of the United Kingdom, and I'll come on to that in a moment, may choose to reapply for membership of the European Union. That is a question for another day, and I would certainly support continued membership. But we must leave first in order to fulfill the instructions of the people in a referendum, which Parliament asked the people to do. What should happen when the dust has settled on all of this? The system itself needs to be reformed. First of all, the House of Lords needs to be abolished. I mean, there's this shocking anachronism that in the 21st century, appointees people who are not elected sit and have a voice in making the law over me and over other British people. It's utterly unjustifiable on any grounds whatsoever. Nick Clegg, and I'm not a fan of Nick Clegg either, but I'm quoting him because I agree wholeheartedly with what he says. What he said, he's not there to justify the unjustifiable, and I'm not going to justify the unjustifiable either. The House of Lords needs to be abolished. It can be replaced by an elected chamber. That's as it should be. We should elect the people who make our laws, not have them. In the past they were landowning aristocrats and sons of the monarch. Now they are prime ministerial appointees. No, come on. This flies in the face of everything that democracy represents. The House of Commons needs to be reformed. First past the post, this throwback of an electoral system needs to be replaced. Yes, I know there was a referendum on this in 2011 and people voted to retain it, but I think people can now see that in fact first past the post does not deliver strong and stable government. It delivers chaos, especially when the Prime Minister of the day is so badly advised that she calls an election and then loses it. Everybody imagines she's going to win, the Conservative Party going to win. No. She snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. First past the post needs to be replaced with a system of proportional representation. The votes of every single member of the electorate need to be represented in Parliament. This winner takes it all theory has had its day. Parliament is no longer representative of the people, which it has to be in a democracy. The House of Commons is no longer representative of the people, which it has to be in a democracy. The Prime Minister should be directly elected, or better yet, the head of state should be directly elected. So yes, this also brings us to another question of the structure of the state itself, the head of state. If we had an elected head of state who had a mandate to intervene in political affairs, we would not be in this Brexit impasse now, but we don't. We are essentially a crowned republic, but a crowned republic nonetheless. The crown is still worn by an hereditary monarch who is in place, who reigns but does not rule, but still is in place because of hereditary privilege. She inherited the crown from her father, who inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his mother. I mean, we could take these arguments back to Thomas Paine in the 18th century, who very famously said, we don't have hereditary doctors, why do we have hereditary heads of state? The argument is as powerful now as it was then. There is no justification for an hereditary head of state. And it's even more important in a political impasse that we have somebody who can break the impasse. Should it be the people? Not in this case. The people should elect the government for a 5-year term. The government administers the country, administers the state, and then is replaced if the electorate are not happy with it. But decisions regarding the government of the country, regarding the legal state of the country, they have to be made by the government. It's impossible. It's impossible to subject decisions in a country with a population of 65 million people to referendum after referendum after referendum. This is no way to run a country, as the Brexit referendum has proven. If we had an elected head of state who had a mandate of his or her own to make decisions, then we wouldn't be in the Brexit impasse now. Since we don't have this, we are. So Brexit also tells us, yes, whatever personal respect and love the people might have for Elizabeth II, this notion that an hereditary monarch bearing an hereditary crown has any role to play in a 21st century democracy is deluding themselves. The institution is an anachronism. It has had its day. It no longer plays any role, any function beyond providing a platform for D-list celebrities to strut about the place and opening hospitals and schools and massaging their egos. And whilst doing charitable work and opening hospitals and schools are good works, that's not justification enough for your family to occupy the only place in which the head of state can be chosen. It also tells us that we need more devolution. Regardless of the incremental steps that have been taken towards devolution in recent years, Britain remains one of the most centralized societies in terms of political power in the world. Westminster is still jealously guarding its monopoly on power certainly within England. What it tells us is that Westminster, more than ever, no longer represents the regions of England. It no longer represents the people it claims to represent. Decisions need to be made locally. They need to be made by the people themselves where they are, not in some far off enclave, isolated from the world in its own little bubble. I'm not a nationalist. I have no love for Britain, for England. But it also tells us that it is time for the union to end. I have no sympathy for any nationalist at all. I'm not a nationalist. It doesn't matter whether you purport to be a civic nationalist or whether your nationalism is the downright ugly sort that is usually nationalism. Nationalism is based always, no matter how you choose to dress it up in pretty clothes. It is about differentiating yourself from another group of people. And that's what it will always be about. That group of people is different from us, and therefore we don't want to be in union with them. If this is not discriminatory, if this is not racist, then what is? What is the definition of racism? What is the definition of discrimination? If you're not differentiating yourself from another group of people simply by virtue of the country in which they were born. But, having said that, it's quite clear that England and Scotland now are very, very different countries, and I have enormous sympathy with the Scottish nationalists who are making the claim that they are being taken out of the European Union against their will, that Scotland is being taken out of the European Union against its will. It's true, it is. Yes, there was a majority in 2014 to remain part of the UK. In the first, there probably will be another quite soon, I hope. In the first referendum on Scottish independence, the Scots voted to remain part of the UK. They are now being taken out of the European Union in a referendum in which they as a nation voted to remain. Of course, this is utterly unjustifiable. This is undemocratic. This again flies in the face of everything we understand to mean democracy. I wholeheartedly support the right and the hope of the Scottish people to become independent from England and from the rest of the United Kingdom, if that is what they want, in a lawful referendum, or by a unilateral declaration of independence, so long as it is peaceful, it is amicable, and it does not descend into anything which becomes ugly and unpleasant. It brings us to Northern Ireland. I'm reluctant to make any sort of statement on the complexities and the questions created for Northern Ireland by Brexit. It has to be the choice of the people themselves as to who makes their laws, as to who governs them, as to whether they remain part of one country or another, whether they join in union with another country, or whether they become independent. It has to be the choice of the people themselves. Every single people have a right to choose their form of government, their lawmakers, the society in which they live. If a majority of the people of Northern Ireland want to remain part of the United Kingdom, they should do so. If a majority of the people of Northern Ireland wish to reunify with the Republic of Ireland, they should do so. It is the duty of government to facilitate this for the people, whilst protecting the rights of the minority. How do we get around this in terms of Brexit? How do we ensure that Northern Ireland remains an integral part of the United Kingdom, if that's what the majority in Northern Ireland want, whilst trying to solve these intractable problems about the border with the Irish Republic? Again, there's a solution in the withdrawal agreement, the treaty that took more than 2 years for Theresa May and her incompetent government to negotiate with the European Union. There is a solution there. Is it ideal? Is it what either side would want? No. No. Nobody is saying that this is the best deal ever negotiated, ever reached. Everybody knows it's a pig in a poke, essentially, but it's the only deal we have. And all of this nonsense, all of these pie-in-the-sky ideas about alternative arrangements and alternative technology, which doesn't even exist and may not exist for another decade or more. These are not solutions. These are kicking the can down the road and opening up a can of worms that nobody wants to open. So, I've been talking for 55 minutes now, and I know you're sick to death of listening to me, because I'm sick to death of talking and listening to myself. What do I want to say in summation? Brexit has to be seen through. Whoever is in Downing Street, and I don't trust the Conservative Party to choose anyone who is going to be able to do anything better than Theresa May, because it's not possible. We have to leave the European Union on the terms of the deal that has already been agreed. You have to compromise. You have to learn to take the good and the bad. That is the nature of leadership. That is the nature of politics. It's the nature of international diplomacy. And you have to show leadership. You have to set an example and to heal the divisions that you, the Conservative Party, and the elite, the political elite in Westminster have created. You have torn the country apart. For this, you have to see it through, and you have to guide by example, and you have to create realistic expectations for people. Then the next stage is to negotiate the future relationship. It has to be one based upon a close friendship with the European Union. It has to be. The European Union, geographically, Europe is 25 miles away from Britain. It is our largest trading market, and it has to remain so. No country in the world can trade only with countries outside its geographical vicinity. And we don't want to make enemies of our erstwhile and current friends. That is not leadership. That is not politics. That is not diplomacy. That is madness, parochialism, and stupidity. And is that what the Conservative Party wants to be remembered for? It seems to me that it is now. It seems to me that the Conservative Party now is only interested in conserving its incompetent stupidity and its tattered reputation. So Brexit needs to be seen through, to as best a conclusion as we can possibly find. A close future relationship has to be negotiated. A close partnership for both sides, which is what the European Union wants as well. When the dust has settled on all of this, we need to have wholesale constitutional reform of the United Kingdom. That includes independence for Scotland, if that's what the Scots themselves want. It includes devolution to every region of England, and whatever further devolution is needed for Wales and for Northern Ireland, and potentially for Irish reunification. This is what is needed. This is what politics has to do. Politics is the implementation of political philosophy. It is the implementation of ideas. It is not about tearing people apart. It is not about creating division. It is about uniting people around common themes, common interests. a common future, a bright future. It is not about tearing people apart. It is not about tearing the fabric of society apart. It is not about sowing division. But whatever has to be done to achieve this future has to be done. We cannot go on kicking the can down the road. This paralysis in Westminster has to end. Vote for the deal. See this through. Negotiate the future relationship. Reform the United Kingdom. Abolish the monarchy. Found a republic. Reform your party political structures as well, because the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and I'm no fan of Jeremy Corbyn either, and the incompetent cretins he's got around him, they have proven themselves to be utterly incapable of representing the people and of following their instructions, of building consensus, of leadership. Utterly incapable. Both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party should look to themselves and say, okay, this is it. We've had our day. It's time to go our separate ways. We need to reform the political culture in this country. You have both of you, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, you have put party before country. You have put political expediency before country, and you have delegitimized yourselves and your right to power, your right to represent the people. So this is my program for change. I've said a lot in this past hour or so, and I have a lot more to say. I hope this is a beginning. I know most people aren't going to watch this, aren't going to listen to it, and have no reason to. I'm a nobody. The same as every other citizen, I'm entitled to my opinion. But what I've said, I hope, appeals to the common sense of at least some people. Look to yourselves, look to what you've done, look to what you're doing, look to where you're taking the country, and do a better job. Be better people. Don't destroy the country, don't destroy society. Okay, that's all for today. I'm going to get down off my soapbox. Next time, my next post, I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about. It could be more Brexit, but maybe not. Maybe that's not the best topic at all. Maybe more politics. Maybe we get onto Trump, that arsehole. Maybe some other aspect of international politics, international relations, who knows. But at some point I'm also going to read more from one of my volumes of poetry. So, until next time, goodbye.